Imagine discovering that your great-great-grandmother wasn't the gentle house servant described in faded family letters, but a woman who held her mistress beneath the surface of a wash basin until the water ran still. Imagine learning that the woman whose bloodline flows through your veins didn't die of fever or old age, but met her end on a gallows, unrepentant, with the names of the drowned still wet on her lips. What would you do with that knowledge? How would you sleep, knowing that resistance lived in your bones long before you ever learned to speak its name? This isn't imagination. This is history, buried beneath layers of sanitized stories and convenient omissions. These are the women who turned wash day into warfare, who transformed the most domestic of duties into acts of rebellion so fierce that entire plantations trembled at the sound of water hitting porcelain. Before we dive deeper into this hidden chapter, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The year was 1841. The place, a sprawling cotton plantation outside Natchez, Mississippi, where the air hung thick with humidity and the weight of unspoken truths. In the big house, porcelain wash basins gleamed like altars to cleanliness, filled each morning with water heated over kitchen fires tended by hands that knew every inch of suffering. These basins weren't just vessels for washing. They were mirrors reflecting the daily humiliation of women forced to bathe those who owned them, to tend to the intimate needs of those who denied their humanity. But on this particular morning, something shifted in the rhythm of the household. The water in Eleanor Whitmore's private wash basin would tell a different story. It would speak of hands that had grown tired of servitude, of lungs that refused to draw breath in submission any longer, of a moment when the enslaved became the executioner. Her name was Celia, though that wasn't the name her mother whispered in the language of their ancestors. She was 26 years old, with scars on her back that mapped the geography of plantation justice and eyes that had learned to look through people rather than at them. For 8 years, she had risen before dawn to heat water, to lay out linens, to stand silent, while Eleanor Whitmore complained about the temperature, the soap, the way the morning light caught the imperfections in her aging skin. Eleanor Whitmore was the kind of woman who measured her worth by the number of people she controlled. 43 years old, childless, married to a man who spent more time in the fields counting profit than in her bed counting affections. She filled the hollow spaces of her life with cruelty disguised as refinement, with power exercised through the most intimate violations of privacy and dignity. Every morning, she summoned Celia not just to tend to her bath, but to witness her vulnerability, to be reminded of the vast distance between mistress and property. The wash basin ritual had become a dance of degradation, choreographed over years of repetition. Celia would enter the chamber carrying steaming water in heavy copper pitchers, her bare feet silent on imported rugs that cost more than most enslaved people's entire lives. She would test the temperature with her wrist, add rose oil that masked but never eliminated the stench of moral decay, and stand with eyes downcast while Eleanor disrobed and settled into the porcelain vessel like a queen claiming her throne. But this morning felt different. The water seemed to hold its breath. The steam rose with unusual urgency. Eleanor's voice carried a sharper edge as she criticized the soap's texture, the water's warmth, the way Celia's hands trembled as she poured. Something had shifted in the delicate balance of power that kept the plantation spinning on its axis of exploitation and endurance. What Eleanor didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she slipped into that familiar ritual, was that Celia had reached a breaking point that had been years in the making. The night before, word had travelled through the slave quarters like wildfire through dry cotton. Sarah, a girl no older than 14, had been found in the overseer's cabin. Her dress torn, her spirit shattered. The same Sarah who used to hum while she worked, who shared her cornbread with the elderly when rations ran short, who dreamed aloud of learning to read despite the laws that made such dreams criminal. Celia had held Sarah through the night, feeling the girl's tears soak through the rough fabric of her own dress, listening to whispered confessions of violence that no child should ever have to voice. And in those dark hours before dawn, something crystallized in Celia's mind. Not rage, that was too simple. Not even hatred, though that lived in her bones like marrow. What she felt was clarity, cold and sharp as the edge of a well-honed blade. The wash basin sat in Eleanor's private chamber like a monument to privilege, its porcelain surface unmarked by the fingerprints of labour, its brass fixtures polished to mirror brightness by hands that would never be acknowledged for their skill. It was large enough to accommodate Eleanor's entire body when she reclined, deep enough to submerge completely if one chose to slip beneath the surface. The water it held each morning was heated to exactly the temperature Eleanor preferred, tested and retested until it met her exacting standards. As Celia prepared the basin that final morning, her movements carried a different quality. Her hands, usually quick and efficient, moved with deliberate precision. She tested the water not once, but 3 times, adjusting the temperature with small additions of heated water from the kitchen reservoir. She arranged the soaps and oils with mathematical precision, laying out towels with the attention to detail of someone preparing for ceremony rather than routine. Eleanor entered the chamber in her silk wrapper, already complaining about the humidity, about the way the morning light revealed new lines around her eyes, about the incompetence of house servants who couldn't manage the simple task of maintaining proper water temperature. She dismissed Celia with a wave of her hand, as she always did, expecting the enslaved woman to retreat to the corner of the room and wait with eyes averted until summoned to assist with drying and dressing. But Celia didn't retreat. She remained standing beside the basin, her posture straight, her eyes no longer focused on the floor, but fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that should have served as warning. Eleanor, absorbed in her own reflection in the water's surface, didn't notice the change. She stepped into the basin, settling into the warm embrace of water that had been prepared by hands she'd never bothered to truly see. The porcelain was cool against Eleanor's skin as she reclined, her head resting against the curved back of the basin, her hair fanned out like seaweed in the clear water. She closed her eyes, allowing herself the luxury of momentary peace in a life otherwise consumed by the management of human property and the maintenance of social position. The water lapped gently against the basin's edges, creating ripples that caught the morning light streaming through tall windows dressed in imported lace. It was in this moment of vulnerability, this brief surrender to comfort and privilege, that Eleanor Whitmore encountered the wages of her cruelty. Celia's hands, those same hands that had heated the water and tested its temperature with such care, moved with swift certainty. One moment Eleanor was floating in warm contentment, the next she was beneath the surface. Celia's palms pressed against her shoulders with a strength born of years hauling water and hauling grief. The struggle was brief, but violent. Water erupted from the basin in great splashes that darkened the imported rugs and stained the wallpaper with patterns that looked like tears. Eleanor's hands clawed at the porcelain edges, her nails scraping against surfaces too smooth to provide purchase. Her legs kicked with desperate energy, sending waves cascading onto the wooden floor where they pooled like accusations waiting to be discovered. But Celia's grip never wavered. Her hands remained steady, pressing down with the accumulated force of 8 years of mourning humiliations, of countless small cruelties, of witnessing the systematic destruction of people she loved. She stared into the churning water, watching Eleanor's face distort beneath the surface, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but a profound sense of completion, as if a long overdue debt was finally being settled. The water gradually stilled. Eleanor's struggles weakened, then ceased entirely. The chamber fell silent except for the steady drip of water from the basin's edges and the sound of Celia's breathing, deep and measured like someone who had just finished a difficult but necessary task. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating a scene that would reshape the power dynamics of an entire plantation and echo through generations of whispered stories. Celia stood over the basin, her dress soaked, her hands steady, her eyes clear. She looked down at Eleanor's still form beneath the water's surface and felt the weight of what she had done settle into her bones. Not regret, not fear, but a profound understanding that this moment had been inevitable from the day she first entered this chamber as a child, carrying water too heavy for her small arms and learning that her life existed only to serve the comfort of others. The silence stretched between heartbeats, between the end of one world and the beginning of another. In that quiet space, Celia began to understand that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The wash basin, once a symbol of her servitude, had become an instrument of her liberation. The water that had once carried only the soap and oils of her mistress's vanity now held something much more precious and dangerous. It held truth. The sound of footsteps on wooden floors would announce the discovery within minutes. Heavy boots belonging to the overseer, lighter steps of house servants who would find their world turned upside down by what floated in that porcelain basin. But in this moment before chaos descended, Celia experienced something she had never known: peace. The kind of peace that comes not from the absence of conflict, but from the presence of justice served by one's own hands. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. The wet towels were gathered and wrung out, the spilled water mopped with linens that would soon tell their own story. But Celia made no attempt to hide what she had done. This wasn't a crime committed in shadow, desperate to avoid discovery. This was a declaration written in water and witnessed by morning light streaming through windows that had seen too much suffering pass beneath their frames. The door handle turned with its familiar brass click. Martha, the head house servant, entered carrying fresh linens and the morning's correspondence. She was a woman of 53 who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of plantation hierarchy by making herself indispensable to both master and enslaved. Her eyes, trained to catalogue every detail of domestic disorder, took in the scene with the rapid assessment of someone whose survival depended on reading situations correctly. The overturned water basin, the soaked rugs, Eleanor Whitmore's pale form beneath the surface, her silk nightgown floating like a shroud, her eyes wide and staring at a ceiling she would never see again. And standing beside it all, Celia, calm as Sunday morning, her hands folded in front of her apron as if she had just finished arranging flowers rather than ending a life. Martha's scream shattered the morning stillness, a sound that carried through the house like a fire bell, summoning every soul within hearing distance. Doors slammed open, feet pounded on stairs, voices rose in confusion and alarm as the news spread from room to room, from house to quarters, from whispered speculation to shouted certainty. The mistress was dead, drowned in her own wash basin. And Celia stood beside the body like a statue carved from defiance. The master of the plantation, Thomas Whitmore, arrived within minutes, his face flushed from running, his shirt hastily buttoned over a chest that heaved with exertion and disbelief. He was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his world through careful calculation and strategic cruelty. The sight of his wife floating lifeless in water, heated by enslaved hands, represented a breakdown in the natural order that he had spent his entire adult life maintaining. He stared at Eleanor's body, then at Celia, then back at the basin, as if the scene might rearrange itself into something more comprehensible. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his hands reaching toward his wife before pulling back, as if touching her might make the reality more real than he could bear. When words finally came, they emerged as a whisper that carried the weight of a world collapsing. "What have you done?" Celia's response came without hesitation, her voice steady and clear as spring water. What needed doing? The simplicity of her answer struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. No denial, no plea for mercy, no attempt to claim accident or self-defense. Just a statement of purpose delivered with the calm authority of someone who had weighed the consequences and found them acceptable. The other enslaved people in the room shifted nervously, understanding that Celia's words had just sealed not only her own fate, but potentially theirs as well. Thomas Whitmore's face transformed from shock to rage, the blood draining from his cheeks before rushing back in a tide of fury that turned his skin the colour of raw meat. He lunged towards Celia, his hands reaching for her throat, but stopped short when she didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, meeting his gaze with eyes that held no fear, no regret, only a profound sense of completion that unnerved him more than any show of defiance could have. "You killed her," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You murdered my wife." "I stopped her," Celia replied, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather or the day's menu. "Same way she stopped Sarah. Same way she stopped all of us, every morning for 8 years. The mention of Sarah's name sent ripples through the crowd of enslaved people gathered in the doorway. They understood the reference, the connection between the previous night's violence and this morning's reckoning. What Thomas Whitmore heard as madness, they recognized as mathematics, cause and effect, action and consequence. The ledger of pain finely balanced by hands that had counted every entry. Within an hour, the constable arrived with a wagon and chains. Word had spread beyond the plantation boundaries, carried by riders whose horses had been spurred to breakneck speed by news too shocking to keep contained. The wife of one of Mississippi's most prosperous planters, drowned by her own house servant, murdered in the most intimate space of domestic life, in the very basin where she performed her daily ablutions. The constable, a man named Benjamin Pierce, who had spent his career maintaining order through strategic violence, approached the scene with the wariness of someone entering a powder magazine with a lit torch. He had handled slave rebellions before, but they typically involved groups of men armed with farming tools and desperate courage. This was something different. A single woman, standing calm and unrepentant beside evidence of her crime, offering no resistance and no excuses. Celia submitted to the shackles without struggle, allowing her wrists to be bound with iron that had restrained countless others before her. As the metal clicked shut, she looked around the room one final time, her gaze lingering on the wash basin that had become her instrument of liberation. The water inside had been disturbed by the removal of Eleanor's body, but it still reflected the morning light in patterns that seemed to dance with their own internal rhythm. The other enslaved people watched in silence as Celia was led from the room, their faces masks of careful neutrality that revealed nothing to the white men present while communicating volumes to each other. They understood that they were witnessing history, not just the end of one woman's life and the beginning of another's journey toward execution, but a moment when the fundamental assumptions of their world had been challenged by the simplest and most direct action imaginable. As the wagon carrying Celia rolled away from the plantation, leaving deep ruts in the earth that would remain visible for weeks to come, the wash basin sat abandoned in Eleanor Whitmore's chamber. No one wanted to touch it, to drain the water that had held such terrible purpose, to clean the porcelain that had witnessed such complete reversal of power. It remained there like a shrine to possibility, proof that even the most carefully constructed systems of oppression contained within them the seeds of their own destruction. The news travelled with the speed of wildfire through the interconnected network of plantations that dotted the Mississippi landscape. In kitchen houses and slave quarters, in fields where cotton grew thick and white, in the hidden spaces where enslaved people gathered to share news and hope, the story of Celia and the wash basin took on legendary proportions. Details were added and embellished with each telling, but the essential truth remained unchanged. A woman had said enough. A woman had acted when action seemed impossible. A woman had turned the master's house into a place of judgment. The trial, when it came, was swift and predictable. Mississippi law in 1841 offered no protection for enslaved people who killed their owners, regardless of provocation or circumstance. The courtroom was packed with spectators drawn by the novelty of the case and the shocking nature of the crime. They came expecting to see a monster, a savage creature driven by inhuman impulses to commit an act of unthinkable violence. Instead, they saw Celia, still calm, still composed, still radiating the same serene certainty that had marked her demeanour since the moment she pressed Eleanor Whitmore beneath the water's surface. When asked to enter a plea, she stood before the judge and jury and spoke words that would echo through the decades that followed. "I am not sorry for what I done. I am sorry it took me 8 years to do it." The courtroom fell silent. Not the polite quiet of respectful attention, but the stunned hush that follows lightning strikes. Celia's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to be extinguished. 8 years. 8 years of morning rituals, of heated water and rose oil, of standing invisible while her humanity was stripped away drop by drop. The jury, 12 white men who had never carried water for anyone, stared at her with the bewilderment of people confronting a language they couldn't understand. But beyond the courthouse walls, in the shadowed corners where truth travelled faster than law, Celia's declaration ignited something that had been smouldering for generations. The wash basin had become more than porcelain and brass. It had become symbol, weapon, altar of reckoning. And across the cotton-heavy landscape of the South, other basins began to hold different kinds of water. Her name was Ruth, and she worked 30 miles east of Natchez on a plantation where the master's wife took 3 baths daily and complained when the water temperature varied by even a degree. Ruth had heard about Celia within hours of the trial's conclusion. The story reached her through the underground network of communication that connected every kitchen, every field, every quarter, where enslaved people whispered hope into existence against impossible odds. On a humid Thursday morning in September, as magnolias dropped their heavy petals onto manicured lawns, Ruth filled the familiar basin with water that steamed like breath in winter air. But her hands, those same hands that had performed this ritual for 6 years, without variation, carried something different today. They carried memory of Celia's words, knowledge that porcelain could hold more than soap and submission. Margaret Thornfield, the plantation mistress, was 38 years old and beautiful in the way that money and cruelty could make a woman beautiful. Her skin remained unmarked by labour, her hands soft as silk, because other hands bore the calluses of her comfort. She treated bathing like a religious ceremony, one that required Ruth to witness every moment of her vulnerability while remaining invisible, a piece of furniture with eyes that must never see and ears that must never hear. The water embraced Margaret as it always did, warm and welcoming as a mother's arms. She settled into the basin with a sigh of contentment, her blonde hair fanning across the surface like spun gold. Her eyes closed in blissful ignorance of the revolution brewing in the heart of the woman who stood beside her with steady hands and a memory full of names. Names of children sold, women violated, men broken on wheels of endless labour and systematic degradation. When Margaret's eyes opened for the last time, they found Ruth's gaze waiting, not lowered in subservience, not averted in shame, but direct and unwavering as starlight. The recognition that passed between them in that instant carried the weight of every morning, every small humiliation, every moment when one woman's comfort had been built upon another's erasure. The water closed over Margaret's face with the finality of a verdict rendered. Her hands clawed at smooth porcelain that offered no purchase, no escape from the justice that had been 6 years in the making. Ruth's palms pressed down with the accumulated strength of countless heavy buckets. Endless scrubbing, arms that had learned endurance through necessity and found power through purpose. The struggle lasted longer than Eleanor Whitmore's had. Margaret was younger, stronger, more desperate in her fight against the inevitable. But desperation could not overcome determination, and privilege provided no protection against hands that had finally remembered their own strength. The water that had once carried only the fragrance of imported soaps now held something infinitely more precious. It held balance. News of the second drowning spread like fever through the plantation community. 2 mistresses, 2 wash basins, 2 enslaved women who had decided that silence was a luxury they could no longer afford. The pattern was emerging, visible to anyone willing to see beyond the comfortable fiction that submission was natural and resistance was madness. Thomas Whitmore, still mourning his wife's death while simultaneously calculating the financial impact of losing valuable property to execution, received word of Margaret Thornfield's drowning with the stunned recognition of a man watching his world dissolve. This wasn't isolated madness. This was contagion, spreading through the very foundation of everything he had built his life upon. Emergency meetings convened in parlours that had never known such urgent whispers. Plantation owners gathered to discuss solutions to a problem they couldn't fully comprehend. How do you guard against the hands that heat your water, that know your most vulnerable moments, that have intimate access to your life and death? How do you maintain control when the controlled have discovered that porcelain shatters under pressure and water flows according to laws more ancient than property rights? Some suggested ending the practice of personal bathing assistants entirely. Let the mistresses tend their own baths, heat their own water, sacrifice luxury for security. But such suggestions were met with outrage from women who had never considered that their comfort might cost more than they were willing to pay. The idea of heating their own water, of lowering themselves to tasks they considered beneath their station, was as unthinkable as the violence that had made such considerations necessary. Others proposed increased surveillance, armed guards stationed outside bathing chambers, restrictions on the movement of house servants. But how do you watch every moment without acknowledging that you fear the very people you claim to own? How do you admit that your safety depends upon the goodwill of those you've systematically brutalized without undermining the entire justification for your brutality? Meanwhile, in slave quarters across Mississippi, Louisiana, and beyond, women gathered around fires that cast dancing shadows on walls built by their ancestors' labor. They spoke in whispers of Celia and Ruth, of water that had become wine, of basins that had become baptismal fonts, where old worlds died and new possibilities were born. They didn't celebrate death, these women who understood the value of life because theirs had been deemed worthless. They celebrated choice, the radical act of saying no in a world that had never taught them the word. The third drowning came in Alabama, where a woman named Flora had spent 12 years filling the same basin for a mistress who beat her children and sold her husband south when his back gave out from years of impossible labor. Flora's hands trembled as she prepared the water that final morning, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she was about to accomplish. The porcelain felt different under her touch, charged with purpose that transformed domestic routine into sacred ritual. Constance Whitman died as the others had, beneath water heated by hands she had never bothered to see as human. But Flora's story diverged from her predecessors in one crucial detail. She didn't wait for discovery. As Constance's body settled into stillness beneath the surface, Flora walked calmly from the bathing chamber, through the grand hallway lined with portraits of dead masters, out the front door that enslaved people were forbidden to use, and into the morning air that tasted of freedom. She made it 7 miles before the dogs caught her scent. 7 miles of walking through Alabama countryside, with her head held high, her shoulders straight, her spirit unbroken by the certainty of what awaited her return. When they brought her back in chains, her eyes held the same serene certainty that had marked Celia's demeanor, the same profound peace that came from completing necessary work. The pattern was undeniable now. 3 plantations, 3 mistresses, 3 wash basins, that had become instruments of revolution, wielded by hands that society had trained to serve but never to strike back. The implications rippled through the consciousness of a region built upon the assumption that violence flowed in only one direction, that power could never be reversed, that water always sought its level, and that level was always determined by those who owned the vessels that held it. But these women had discovered something that their masters had forgotten in their comfortable certainty of control. Water was patient, but it was also persistent. Given enough time, enough pressure, enough accumulated force, it could wear away stone, reshape landscapes, carve new channels through earth that had seemed permanently settled. The wash basins had become more than containers for daily ablutions. They had become laboratories where enslaved women experimented with the fundamental laws of power and discovered that even the most carefully maintained hierarchies contained within them the possibility of their own dissolution. In courtrooms across the South, judges struggled to comprehend crimes that didn't fit existing categories. These weren't rebellions in the traditional sense, armed uprisings that could be crushed with superior firepower and strategic violence. These were individual acts of calculated resistance, performed with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized years of faithful service. The women didn't deny their actions or plead for mercy. They stood before their accusers with the dignity of people who had finally remembered their own worth and found the price of silence too high to pay. The executions, when they came, were public spectacles designed to restore order through display of consequence. Crowds gathered to witness justice as white society understood it, the reassertion of natural hierarchy through ritual elimination of those who had dared to challenge it. But something unexpected happened at these gatherings. The condemned women faced their deaths with the same calm certainty they had shown in life, transforming what was meant to be demonstration of power into testimony of resistance. Celia died first, on an October morning when the Mississippi air carried the scent of cotton ready for harvest. She walked to the gallows with steady steps, her head uncovered, her eyes fixed on a horizon that seemed to hold promises invisible to those who watched her die. When asked for final words, she spoke clearly enough for every person present to hear. Water finds its way to the sea. Always has. Always will. The rope silenced her voice, but not her message. In slave quarters throughout the region, her words were repeated, memorized, passed down like prayers or recipes or lullabies. Water finds its way to the sea. It became code, comfort, and prophecy all at once. A reminder that even the most controlled systems contained within them the seeds of change, that patience and persistence could accomplish what rebellion and rage could not. Ruth followed 2 weeks later in a town square, surrounded by buildings built with slave labor and maintained by slave hands. Her execution drew an even larger crowd, curiosity having overcome initial shock as news of the wash basin drownings spread beyond plantation boundaries into the consciousness of a region grappling with the implications of resistance that wore the mask of service. She spoke no final words, but her silence carried its own eloquence. As the trapdoor opened and her body dropped, a sound rose from the crowd that witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. Not cheering or jeering, but something like a collective intake of breath, as if the entire assembly had suddenly realized they were watching more than an execution. They were witnessing the death of an idea that had sustained their world, the comfortable fiction that submission was natural and resistance was impossible. Flora's death came last, in Alabama sunshine that seemed too bright for such dark business. But even as the rope tightened around her neck, even as her feet left the platform for the final time, her eyes remained fixed on something beyond the crowd, beyond the immediate moment of ending. Those who stood closest swore they saw her lips move in the seconds before death claimed her, forming words that sounded like names, like prayers, like promises being kept. The wash basins remained, of course. Porcelain doesn't die, brass doesn't bleed. Water continues to flow regardless of the purposes it serves or the hands that direct its movement. But the basins were different now, marked by history that couldn't be scrubbed away with soap and hot water. Some were destroyed, smashed to fragments that cut the hands of those who tried to gather the pieces. Others were abandoned, left to collect dust and spider webs in chambers that no one dared enter. But many remained in use, filled each morning by hands that remembered what had happened, what was possible, what price had been paid for the knowledge that resistance could take any form and justice could flow from any source. The water in these basins carried more than soap and rose oil. It carried memory, warning, and promise all at once. A reminder that the most dangerous weapon in any system of oppression is the moment when the oppressed stop believing in their own powerlessness. The drownings ended, but their impact continued to ripple outward like rings on still water disturbed by stones thrown from hands that refused to remain empty. In houses throughout the South, morning bathing rituals became exercises in careful tension, performances where both performer and audience understood that scripts could be rewritten without notice, that familiar ceremonies could become something altogether different without warning. Mistresses found themselves studying the faces of women who heated their water, searching for signs of the same calm certainty that had preceded their sisters' deaths. They saw danger in steady hands, threat in averted eyes, revolution in the simple act of testing water temperature with a fingertip. The intimate trust required for personal service had been shattered by the knowledge that intimacy could cut both ways, that vulnerability was a sword with two edges. House servants moved through their duties with the awareness that they carried in their hands the power to reshape the world, one basin at a time. They understood that the women who had died had given them more than examples of resistance. They had provided proof that change was possible, that the most carefully maintained systems of control contained within them the possibility of their own transformation. The story spread beyond the plantation boundaries, carried by winds that respected no property lines and recognized no ownership of truth. In northern newspapers, the wash basin drownings were reported as evidence of southern barbarism, proof that slavery corrupted both enslaved and enslaver. But these accounts missed the deeper truth that enslaved people understood instinctively. This wasn't corruption or madness. This was mathematics, the inevitable result of equations that had been balanced not with gold or cotton, but with blood and water, and the accumulated weight of suffering transformed into action. In the months and years that followed, other forms of resistance emerged, inspired by the knowledge that power could flow in unexpected directions. Kitchen fires burned too hot, accidentally destroying masters' dinners. Laundry came back stained with substances that couldn't be identified or removed. Sewing needles found their way into unexpected places, causing small wounds that festered with mysterious persistence. None of these acts carried the dramatic finality of drowning, but all of them carried the same message. The hands that served could also strike. The eyes that looked down could also look through. The voices that spoke only when spoken to could also choose silence as a form of speech more eloquent than words. The wash basins became symbols, appearing in songs sung in quarters after dark, in stories told by grandmothers to children who needed to understand that resistance took many forms and courage came in many shapes. They represented the transformation of the most intimate spaces of oppression into sites of liberation, the conversion of tools of servitude into instruments of justice. Years passed, and the immediate terror of the drownings faded into the background of regional consciousness. New crises emerged. New challenges demanded attention. New forms of resistance evolved to meet changing circumstances. But the basins remained, silent witnesses to moments when the impossible had become inevitable, when the powerless had discovered power they never knew they possessed. In kitchens across 3 states, Other women felt the water change temperature in their hands. Not the physical heat that remained constant, measured and tested as it always had been. But something else shifted in those morning rituals, something that made ordinary porcelain feel electric against weathered palms. Sarah worked 40 miles north of where Celia had made her stand, in a house where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow fragments across imported marble floors. She had heard the whispers, felt the tremor that passed through the network of knowing that connected every quarter, every kitchen, every heart that beat with the rhythm of resistance long suppressed. The mistress she served, Victoria Randolph, was younger than the others, barely 25, and newly married to wealth that stretched across river bottoms thick with cane. The wash basins are gone now, melted down or shattered, buried beneath centuries of silence and shame. But the water remembers. In every kitchen where hands still tremble over heated vessels, in every moment when the powerless discover they are not as powerless as they believed, the echo of those three women lives on. Celia, Ruth, and Flora didn't just drown their mistresses. They drowned the lie that submission was natural, that cruelty could flow forever in one direction without consequence. Their names may not appear in history books, but they carved themselves into the very DNA of resistance, proving that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the simplest act of saying no. Water always finds its way to the sea.